Welcome to part 3 of this Clematis tutorial. In this part, I'm going to show you how to finish off the stem and make some leaves. So for this part of the tutorial, you'll need your green extra fine crepe. You'll need doublet, either made with 2 layers of the extra fine or any green doublet of your choice. You'll need some 24 gauge wire, your tacky glue, a little bit of floral tape can be handy, but not it's not necessary. You can do without it if you like. All right, so let's get started. So before we make any leaves, I'm going to quickly show you how to make your own doublet crepe paper using 2 layers of extra fine crepe. And in this case, I'm using this iron-on adhesive called Heat and Bond. I actually just happen to have this around in my craft supply, and it'll work great for this. You could also use some sort of fusible webbing used in quilting, or Stitch Witch, I think it's called. There's a few other things you can use. So for this Heat and Bond material, you'll see that one side is really shiny and has a texture to it, and the other side is just matte. The shiny side is where the adhesive is, so that's what is going to be put down onto the paper first. But before we even do that, I want to quickly iron out the paper by itself so that it's nice and flat. It'll just be easier to work with. And one important thing to keep in mind when ironing crepe is you don't want to go back and forth like you would with fabric. It's going to tear the paper and distort the crepe. So for crepe paper, all you need to do is hold and press. And just hold and press. And you want to just, as much as you can, just go straight up and straight down. And the wrinkles come out really quickly, really easy. This iron is on a silk setting right now, which is medium, with no steam. You definitely don't want to use any steam at all with your crepe paper. All right, so that looks good. Our paper is nice and flat. So the first thing is to figure out which side is your shiny. So it's right here. I'm gonna make sure to turn this over so the shiny side is actually on your crepe. Very important. You don't want the sticky side up. It's gonna get all over your iron and other stuff, and you definitely don't want that. So I've cut this just a little bit smaller than the crepe, and that will avoid getting any sort of sticky mess on my ironing board. You could also put down a piece of paper or something if you wanted to. So for this particular type of fusing, you actually iron straight onto the paper for this first step. Some fusible web, you can just sandwich that right away, but for this one, the first step is to have the sticky side down onto the bottom layer and just press and hold 1 to 2 seconds. And this activates the glue underneath. It doesn't have to be super long. That's probably good enough. And then we'll just let it cool for a second. Let it just cool down. Doesn't have to cool for a long time, just enough so that it's not fresh off of the iron. So we'll take a quick peek. Peel this paper off. Looks good. You can see, almost looks like there's a layer of double stick tape coming off onto this crepe. So that's good. There we go. And now just put the top layer on, just like a little sandwich, and repeat. Press and hold. Go all the way across the paper. make sure to get all the edges. And then once this is fully cool, I'm going to actually trim the very edge off with that doesn't have any glue on it. And that way we'll have a nice fully stuck piece of doublet. So there you go. There's your doublet. And in the next section, I'll show you how to cut out the leaves and put those together. So now it's time to go over how to make the leaves. You'll either have two halves that you've cut out of the template, or you can start with a rectangle. This is doublet that I made just in the previous section, and you can see it's really sturdy, really thick, but it doesn't stretch much. So that's one thing to keep in mind if you are using fusible web to make doublets. Depending on the type of web you have, it may or may not retain some of the stretch. So for these leaves, it's not a problem. I don't really need to stretch them out anyways. So in this case, this type of doublet will be great. So if you're starting with a rectangle, this one is 3 inches wide by about 2 1/4, 2 1/2 inches tall. I'll start with that, and I'll just make a diagonal cut. And then flip over so both pieces have the crepe pattern meeting in the center in a V, kind of like this. Similar to how the petals are constructed. So whether you've got the shapes already cut out or you're starting with the basic rectangle, just apply some glue in a thin line. You do want a nice even bead of glue along the entire leaf. That way you'll get a good seal, and since we're also going to be sandwiching a wire in the middle of this leaf, you really do need enough glue to keep that paper sealed down around the wire. So I'll just take my little wire piece, and I won't put it all the way to the top. I'll just leave, you know, maybe a 1/4 inch, because a lot of times you'll end up trimming the leaf at the very top to get a clean edge, and you don't want to have to clip some of that wire. So get that set. I like to add just a touch of glue on top of the wire too. I mean, you don't want to overdo it because you don't want to end up with a gluey mess, but just having that little bit on that top edge of the wire helps the paper to really seal down around it. All right, just line up and make sure that you've got enough overlap so that the paper can go all the way on both sides of the wire. And you really do need to pinch really quite firmly, especially if you have a doublet, like homemade doublet that doesn't stretch much. You really do need to pinch to make sure you get a good seal. So just kind of pinch up and down until you can feel that the paper is really sticking to itself. And here we go again. Match it up, pinch, pinch, pinch. So you see how the paper is overlapping a bit here? Don't worry about that because we can go back and trim it after it's dry. Get a good seal going. Okay, I think this is good. All right. So these stems can just stay as plain wire for the moment. We don't really need to cover them because they're going to be wrapped into the stem. And if you're starting out with a plain rectangle, once it's had a few minutes to set, you know, let the glue set a little bit. I really enjoy just doing a free cut, especially for these leaves that They don't need to be completely symmetric on both sides. And I like the way that turns out when each side looks a little bit different. Now, this won't work for every single type of leaf, but for these leaves, I just really enjoy doing this. Of course, there's nothing wrong with just using the template. Kind of do whatever works best for you. All right, there's my leaf. While we're waiting for those leaves to completely dry, we can start working on finishing a stem. So this is the flower that was created in the last section, and it's had a chance to dry, so that's all ready to go. So as I mentioned earlier, the clematis flower doesn't really have any sepals that come out of the stem at the bottom of the flower. It's just kind of the petals straight into the stem. So that's why we try to keep it, you know, as tapered as possible. And there's a special finishing technique that I like to use in flowers that don't really have sepals. And I like to, as the first layer of paper wrapped around the stem, I like to use a torn edge. And that just really helps soften that transition. It looks a little more organic. When you just have a straight paper edge, it just, it looks very manufactured. But with a torn edge, it just has a much softer look that I just prefer. So you just need a little strip. It doesn't have to be really long because it really only needs to go around, you know, a couple of times. So just stretch it out just a tad. And actually, I'm going to even just tear this in half. This is enough for 2 flowers. Get some glue on there, just dot, dot, dot. And just get really up high and pretty snug. You want to cover the bottom of those petals where they are glued on. And just a nice soft transition. You can see that it's just a little bit softer, and that's some glue there. That'll just dry clear. A nice softer transition in between the petals and the stem. So for the rest of the stem, I'm just going to cut some strips of the green paper and wind it around. I usually just fold it up a little bit, and you see the grain is going this way, and I make some strips. I just prefer the way that the paper looks compared to the floral tape. But if you like the floral tape, you could also just use that to finish your stem. I tend to use this more just to hold things in place, and then I cover it with paper. So I'll just give it a little stretch. This one's a little bit wide, so I'm kind of doing two rows of dots. If your strip's a little more narrow, you can just use one dot down the center and just kind of pinch to get it started. Pinch as you go and roll. Now, this paper is quite delicate, so you don't want to pull too hard, but it does have a little bit of stretch. So, you know, you can pull it to get it snug, and then feel free to just, you know, really roll it in between your fingers to get a nice smooth finish. And you can add a little more paper here too if you want to build it up to have a little smoother transition in between this part and the stem. That's totally a good idea. I'll do a little bit more to get near the bottom of the stem. And there we go. Oops, ripped. That's okay. And if you're not sure how long of a stem you really need yet, you can always finish it later or clip it off now or whatever works. So great. Okay, we've got a paper covered stem. Now we'll add a few leaves. So the clematis plant, the leaves grow directly opposite each other, kind of how you see here. And think about how you want to use this flower. Is it going to be in an arrangement full of a bunch of other flowers? You might want to move the leaves up just a little bit higher. If it's going to be, you know, on its own or just with a few other flowers, then having the leaves a little further down is a little more natural for this plant. So I'll bend the stem wires down a little bit. And they can be, you know, repositioned after everything's all put together. So I just like to take a small amount of floral tape, stretch it out. That's the only way it'll get sticky is if you stretch it. And I like to anchor my leaves onto the stem with floral tape. It's just easier than trying to do it all with a piece of glue colored paper or glue covered paper. It's just easier to manipulate with the floral tape. So just kind of pinch everything into place, give it a few twirls. You want to pull and stretch when you're using this floral tape. Kind of have them positioned right across from each other. It looks good. Now I'll just take another piece of paper, add some glue, and cover that floral tape. And get it nice and snug up to the base of those leaves. That way, that plain wire that we used in the middle of the leaf is completely hidden. And you can see that the stem is getting a little bit thicker here. And, you know, again, depending on how you're using the flower, if the entire stem's going to show, you might want to add some more paper all the way down for, you know, uniform thickness. Or if you know the stem really isn't going to show, it doesn't really matter. So now from here you can position your leaves. There you go. You can do whatever organic looking curve you like. And there you have it. You can also add a little bit of Mod Podge to your leaves if you want a touch of shine. This one does have a light coating of Mod Podge to it, but you certainly don't have to do that. There you go. Finished clematis flower. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I would love to see your creations if you decide to make one and post it online. My Instagram handle is Inga Ilze Peterson, INGAILZEPETERSON. Thank you so much.